The car had been sitting at the quarry entrance for 11 minutes before Loretta Vance turned off the engine. She knew because she watched the clock on the dashboard without meaning to, the way you watch things when your mind refused to look at what was directly in front of you. 11 minutes of staring through a windshield filmed with road dust at what was supposed to be her new home, her fresh start, the thing Clifton had called fair, when he handed her the keys across the kitchen table of the house she had spent 30 years making beautiful. The quarry stretched before her like something the earth had given up on. Gray limestone walls rose on three sides, creating a kind of natural amphitheater that had been carved out of the Virginia hillside decades ago and abandoned when the rock ran dry and the economics stopped making sense. The floor was a wasteland of weeds pushing through cracked stone, rusted machinery, half swallowed by years of neglect, broken rocks scattered like the aftermath of something violent that had happened long ago and been forgotten. At the far end of this gray bowl, maybe 200 feet from where she sat, there was a structure. Small, weathered to the color of old bone, roof visibly sagging on one side. That was the tool shed. That was her property. Loretta was 64 years old. She had gray hair she'd stopped coloring 2 years ago when Clifton made a comment about women who tried too hard. She had arthritis in both hands that made mornings a negotiation between will and pain. She had a college degree that existed only as a memory of a person she had almost become, before Clifton said they didn't need two incomes, and she had believed him at 22, because she loved him and because the world had not yet taught her what that kind of believing cost. She had 30 years of making houses beautiful on budgets that required creativity and patience and a particular kind of stubbornness that no one had ever called a skill, because it happened inside a home rather than outside one. She had 3 adult children who had sat with their father in the lawyer's office and nodded along when terms like equitable distribution were used, who had called her afterward to say that Dad was being fair and that she was making this harder than it needed to be. She had $473 in a checking account. She had 2 suitcases in the trunk of a 2009 Civic with a slow leak in the rear left tire. She had the quarry. The November wind found its way through the window seal she kept meaning to have replaced and pressed cold against the side of her face. Outside, the sky was the specific gray of late autumn in the Shenandoah Valley, the kind of gray that wasn't dramatic, wasn't stormy, was simply the absence of warmth. The mountains in the distance were stripped bare. Even they looked tired. "You can have the quarry," Clifton had said. He'd been sitting across the kitchen table in the house on Millbrook Drive, the one with the wraparound porch she'd refinished herself 3 summers ago, the one with the kitchen she'd redesigned twice, on budgets that would have made a contractor laugh. He'd been wearing the blue sweater she'd given him for Christmas 4 years ago. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who had already moved on to whatever came next and was simply wrapping up administrative details. "Nobody wants it anyway," he'd said. "At least you'll have somewhere to go." Somewhere to go. Loretta opened the car door and the cold came in like it had been waiting. She pulled her coat tighter, a wool blend she'd had for 8 years. Still good, she took care of things and walked toward the shed. The quarry floor was uneven beneath her feet, the ground broken and heaved by years of freeze and thaw, and her knees registered every inch of it. She walked slowly, not because she was afraid, but because her body at 64 had developed opinions about pace that it expressed with authority. The wind moved through the quarry walls in a low, continuous sound that wasn't quite a moan and wasn't quite silence, something in between. Up close, the shed was worse than it had looked from the car. The wood had weathered past gray into something closer to silver, the color of things left out in weather for too long. The roof sagged decisively on the left side, the old shingles curling up at their edges. One of the 2 windows was cracked from corner to corner, a clean, diagonal line that suggested something had struck it with precision. The door hung slightly crooked in its frame, the wood having expanded and contracted through too many seasons until the relationship between door and frame had become approximate. Loretta put her hand on the door and pushed. The smell reached her first, mildew deep and settled into the wood grain. Beneath it, old machine oil, the kind that had soaked into concrete over years until it became part of the material itself. And underneath everything, the cold mineral smell of earth and stone that no amount of human habitation had ever fully displaced. The interior was 15 feet by 20. Concrete floor cracked in several places, the cracks filled with the accumulated dirt of years. Rusted tools hung on pegboard along one wall. Most of them beyond use, their metal surfaces corroded past the point where even effort could redeem them. Old paint cans were stacked in one corner, their lids sealed by dried drips. A wooden workbench ran along the back wall, its surface scarred with cuts and burns, and the ghost rings of coffee cups that someone had set there long ago during long ago work. And in the far corner, half hidden by an old tarp, a mattress. Loretta walked to it and pulled the tarp back. The mattress was stained and old, its fabric worn thin in the center from years of use by whoever had last slept here, a caretaker, perhaps someone who had stayed nights at the quarry when work required it. The surface was scattered with the small, dark evidence of mice. She stood looking at it for a long moment. She was 64 years old. She had arthritis and a slow tire leak and $473. Her children thought their father was being fair. The man she had given 30 years to was currently, in all probability, having dinner in the kitchen she had designed in the house she had made into something worth living, and entirely comfortable with what he had called equity. Loretta sat down onto the mattress. Her legs didn't give out. She chose to sit. That distinction mattered to her, though she couldn't have said exactly why. The cracked window let in a rectangle of gray afternoon light that fell across the concrete floor and did nothing to warm it. Outside, the wind moved through the quarry walls. The rusted tools on the pegboard were still. The cold was the specific cold of enclosed spaces that had been empty for a long time air, that had been sitting undisturbed for seasons, carrying its own particular weight. Loretta put her face in her hands. She had promised herself she was done crying. She had cried through the lawyers' meetings and through the conversation with her youngest, who had said, "Mom, please just try to understand his perspective." And through the 3 nights she had spent on her friend Darlene's couch in Staunton while she figured out what came next. She had cried until crying felt like a language she had exhausted, until she had nothing left to say in it. But the shed had its own argument for tears, and her body was done taking directions. She sobbed. Not quiet, contained grief, but the kind that came from somewhere below dignity, from the place where 30 years of accommodation and compromise and shrinking yourself down to fit someone else's dimensions and had been stored without her full awareness. She sobbed until her throat was raw and her chest ached, and there was nothing left in her but the hollow physical fact of exhaustion. Then she slept on the mouse-stained mattress with her coat pulled around her because there was nothing else to do, and she was very tired. Dawn arrived before she was ready for it. The cold had deepened overnight, and when Loretta moved, every joint in her body sent up its own particular complaint. Her back had developed a specific opinion about the mattress. Her hands, always stiff in the mornings, required a full minute of careful coaxing before they would close properly. She was 64, and her body had learned over the past year to remind her of this regularly, the way a creditor reminded you of a debt. She managed to stand, pulled her coat back into place, went to the crooked door, and pushed it open. The sun was coming up over the eastern rim of the quarry. She hadn't thought about the way morning light would move through this space. She hadn't thought about it because she had arrived in late afternoon and had not expected to find anything worth thinking about. But the sun at that angle, coming over the limestone rim in a low horizontal sweep, did something to the quarry that stopped her in the doorway. The walls were not gray. She had thought they were gray because she had arrived in gray light on a gray afternoon with a gray feeling in her chest. But in the direct light of early morning, the limestone revealed what it actually was, layered, in various cream and tan, and a pale rose pink where the mineral composition changed, banded in horizontal lines that recorded decades of geological time. The walls didn't look like the inside of a wound. They looked like the pages of something very old and very patient. And from a crack in the far wall, maybe 8 feet up from the quarry floor, water moved. Not a stream, not anything dramatic. Just a slow seep of water from somewhere behind the stone, finding its way through the limestone, the way water always found its way, following the path of least resistance through the rock, emerging here, running down the face of the wall in a thin, irregular line, collecting at the base in a small pool that was perfectly clear. Loretta walked toward it. Slowly, the ground uneven beneath her feet, the cold air sharp in her lungs. When she reached the wall, she stopped and looked at the water moving down the limestone face. Then she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the stone beside the trickle. The rock was cold. The water was colder. It moved across her palm with the indifference of something that had been doing exactly this for a very long time and had not been waiting for her arrival to do it. The quarry that Clifton had given her, because nobody wants it anyway, had water running through it. Had been running through it probably since long before the quarry was carved out of the hillside, since long before Clifton Vance was born, since before anyone in this valley had decided that what was underground had any relationship to what things were worth. Loretta stood with her hand on the cold stone and felt something move through her that wasn't hope exactly. It was smaller than hope and more specific. It was a question forming somewhere below conscious thought. If water could still flow through this abandoned place, if stone that had been written off could still catch morning light and reveal that it was something other than gray, then maybe abandoned was a description of what someone else had decided, not a fact about the thing itself. She pulled her hand away from the wall, looked at her palm marked with the dust of limestone and the cold of the water that had passed through it. These hands. Clifton had looked at these hands for 30 years and seen the labor they produced. The meals, the repairs, the transformations of ordinary spaces into places worth living in without ever quite seeing the hands themselves, without ever once asking what else they might be capable of given different circumstances, different materials, different permission. She turned and looked back at the shed. It was still a disaster. The roof still sagged. The door still hung crooked. Nothing about what she had noticed in the past 10 minutes changed any of the practical facts of her situation. She was still 64, still had $473, still had arthritic hands and a slow tire leak, and children who had decided their father was being reasonable. But she had also just learned that something she had been told was worthless had water running through it that nobody had bothered to notice. She went back inside and began to work. Not with any plan, not with any vision of what she was working toward, simply because standing still in the cold was worse than moving, and because some part of her that had not yet received the message that she was supposed to be finished had apparently decided otherwise. She started with the mattress. Dragged it outside, it was heavier than it should have been, saturated with years of damp, and her back registered its full opinion of the process and left it in the section of the quarry floor that would receive the most direct sun. Then she found the broom. It was leaning behind the door old enough that the bristles had compressed into a shape more suggestion than tool, but it still worked. She swept. The work was not elegant. Her hands ached from the first 10 minutes, the arthritis inflamed by the cold and the gripping. Her back, already unhappy about the mattress, developed a sharper complaint about the bending. She had to stop twice and stand straight and breathe through it before continuing. She was 64 and her body had not signed up for this, and it made that clear in the specific language of joints and muscle that left no room for interpretation. She kept going because stopping meant sitting down in the middle of what she just swept, and she wasn't ready to sit yet. By the time the afternoon light began to flatten and cool, the shed was cleaner. Not clean, decades of embedded grime didn't respond to a single afternoon's attention, but cleaner. She had swept out the mouse evidence and the accumulated dirt and the dead leaves that had found their way in through the gap under the door. She had used wet rags from a bucket she'd filled at the spring pool to wipe down the workbench and the pegboard and the concrete floor in the areas where it mattered most. She brought her 2 suitcases inside, found the corner least affected by the roof's structural opinions, and established that as her territory. Used the old tarp to cover the section of ceiling where she could see daylight through the shingles. That night, she slept on the dried mattress, still uncomfortable but drier, with her coat over her in one of the suitcases as a windbreak against the draft from the window. She slept hard and dreamlessly, the sleep of a body that had been used past its preferences and had simply shut down to recover. 2 weeks passed in this way. She established the architecture of survival. Wake before dawn, before the cold fully set into the joints, and move immediately. Wash in the pool at the base of the spring. The water was cold enough to make her gasp, but it was clean and it was hers. Eat from the supply of protein bars and canned goods she'd bought with $60 on the drive out from Staunton. Work. She spoke to no one. No one called. She had her phone charged from the car, checking it each morning with the discipline of someone completing a required task, reading nothing, finding nothing. Her children had their own lives and their father's version of events, and the comfort of having made a choice and stood by it. Loretta had the quarry. Her body hurt constantly. The hands swelled from the work and the cold, the knuckles enlarged to the point where she wore her coat like a mitten. Some mornings, fingers curled inside the sleeve rather than through the proper openings. Her back went from aching to what she thought of as its formal statement of grievance, a deep, specific pain in the lower left that flared without warning and took her breath. She was 64, and she had never in her adult life used her body this way, and it was making a thorough record of its objections. She kept going because the alternative was waiting, and she had discovered that she was done waiting for things. She had waited for 30 years in the patient, accommodating way of a woman who had been told that patience was a virtue and helpfulness was love. She was finished with that particular curriculum. On the 14th day, she moved a section of cracked concrete in the far corner of the shed. She was looking for something to use as a doorstop. The crooked door had a tendency to swing wide and bang against the exterior wall, and she wanted to wedge it open while she worked. The concrete section was roughly the size of a paving stone broken from the floor along a seam that had given way years ago, and she worked it loose with the pry bar she'd found among the rusted tools and leveraged it up from the floor. Beneath it, pressed into the shallow gap between the lifted concrete and the undisturbed floor, was a tin box. Small, perhaps the size of a shoebox but flatter. The metal was corroded on the outside, rusted along the seams, the kind of rust that happened over years rather than months. She picked it up. It had weight to it, and something shifted inside when she tilted it, something dry, something that moved with a papery rustling. She set it on the workbench and pried the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept the moisture out, were packets of seeds. Old packets, their paper envelopes soft with age, the printing on them faded to near illegibility. She picked up the top packet and held it to the light from the window and read what she could of the label. One word was clear. One word the person who had written the label had pressed down on with enough force to leave an impression in the paper beneath. Marigolds. Below it in smaller writing that she had to angle toward the light to read plant in spring. Loretta stood at the workbench with the seed packet in her arthritic hands. Somebody had been here. Not recently, the tin and the oilcloth and the seeds themselves spoke to years, perhaps decades. But someone had stood in this shed, in this space that Clifton had given her, because nobody wants it anyway, and had thought about next spring, had thought carefully enough about next spring to wrap seeds in oilcloth and press them under concrete where they would be protected from the damp. Someone had believed this place was worth planning for, worth saving something in. The quarry was not dead. It had water running through its walls and seeds pressed into its floor, and morning light that turned its limestone from gray to cream and rose pink, and all of it had been here the entire time, waiting with the patience of things that did not need to be believed in to continue existing. Loretta set the seed packet back in the tin and closed the lid carefully. She straightened, which took a moment, in the cooperation of a back that was not enthusiastic about the process. Then she stood in the shed that was hers. However, it had come to her whatever circumstances had delivered it, and looked at the workbench and the pegboard with its rusted tools, and the patched ceiling, and the corner she had made into something approaching a living space. Outside, through the open door, the quarry walls caught the last of the afternoon sun. The water moved down the limestone face with its usual indifference, collecting in the pool, at the base perfectly clear, unbothered by whether anyone was there to see it. Loretta walked outside and stood at the edge of the pool and looked at her reflection in the still water. 64 years old, hair gone fully gray, face weathered by 2 weeks of outdoor living in November. Hands swollen and marked with limestone dust and the particular calluses that came from work she hadn't done before. She looked, she thought, like someone who was still here. That was not a small thing. She had sat on a mouse-stained mattress 2 weeks ago and thought with something approaching conviction that this was where it ended, that 64 and discarded and alone in an abandoned quarry was simply the final chapter of a story that had not been particularly kind to its protagonist. But the water hadn't stopped moving. The seeds had waited in their oilcloth. The morning light had revealed that the walls were not gray. She picked up the tin from where she'd set it on the concrete outside the shed door and held it with both hands. The metal was cold. The seeds inside shifted with that dry, rustling sound. She thought about marigolds, which were orange and yellow and stubborn, and bloomed hard right up until the first frost, which did not ask permission to be bright. Plant in spring. Someone had written that with intention. Someone had believed there would be a spring worth planting in. And now Loretta Vance, 64 years old, arthritis in both hands, $473 in a checking account, sole resident of an abandoned quarry in the Shenandoah Valley, was the one holding that intention forward. She looked out at the quarry floor, at the weeds and the broken stone and the rusted machinery, and the space that would need to be cleared before anything could be planted, at the walls that caught light in the morning, at the water that had been running all along. She did not feel hope. Hope was too large and too uncertain. What she felt was something more specific and more durable. She felt the weight of the tin in her hands. She felt the cold air moving through the quarry with its smell of limestone and winter coming. She felt her feet on the uneven ground. She was still here. The water was still moving. Spring was months away. That was enough. For now, that was everything. The first pipe took 3 days to get right. Loretta had found it in the machinery graveyard at the far end of the quarry, a length of galvanized steel pipe 1.25 inches diameter, corroded on the outside but intact, which she determined by tapping it along its length, the way a doctor tapped a chest, listening for the sound of something hollow and uncompromised. Most of what she found out there was beyond recovery. Machinery that had been left to the weather for decades, its metal surfaces eaten through its moving parts, fused by rust into permanent stillness. But the pipe was good. She found 3 more lengths of it buried under a collapsed wooden frame and a collection of fittings in a rusted coffee can that someone had organized with a care that time had made irrelevant. She didn't know how to plumb. She had watched plumbers work in the way you watched anyone work in your house over 30 years with attention, but without the intention of doing it yourself. She understood the basic logic: water moved downhill, fittings connected sections. The goal was a continuous path from source to destination with no place for water to escape between. She spent the first day measuring. The spring emerged from the crack in the wall at approximately 8 feet up. The shed door was 63 feet away, measured in her own paces. The quarry floor was not level. It dropped perhaps 2 feet from the wall to the midpoint, then rose slightly toward the shed. She walked the path 4 times, studying the ground, noting where the grade changed and what that meant for water moving through a pipe laid along the surface. The second day, she laid the pipe out dry, fitting the sections together without sealing them, adjusting the angle propping sections on broken stone where the grade needed correcting. Her hands hurt from the metal, from the cold, from the effort of threading fittings that had been sitting in a coffee can for years and required persuasion. She dropped things. She cursed once quietly into the cold air of the quarry, which absorbed the word without comment. The third day, she sealed the connections with what she had: strips of old rubber cut from a deteriorated gasket she'd found on the workbench, wrapped until the joint was tight. She fitted the intake end of the pipe into the crack above the spring pool, packing the surrounding gap with clay-heavy soil from the quarry floor that she worked with her fingers until it held. Then she stood back and watched. Water moved into the pipe. She could hear it, a low, sustained sound, the sound of something that had been flowing anyway, now given a direction. It traveled along the pipe through the 3 connected sections around the gentle curve she'd engineered with a 45-degree fitting, and emerged at the far end in a steady stream that fell onto the quarry floor 6 inches from the shed door. Clean water, running to her. She had made that happen with salvaged pipe and old rubber, and the particular patience that came from having no alternative but to figure it out. Loretta stood in the cold morning air with water running over her boots and felt something crack open in her chest that was not quite crying and not quite laughing and had no name she could locate. She stood there for a long time. The water kept coming. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the first 2. Survival had been reactive, responding to cold, to hunger, to the shed's many structural failures, to the raw fact of being in a place she hadn't chosen and wasn't prepared for. What came now was something else. It was slower and more deliberate, and it came from inside rather than from the pressing demands of circumstance. She started with the ground in front of the shed. The quarry floor there was a chaos of weeds and broken stone and years of accumulated debris, leaves blown in from the trees above the rim, fragments of old equipment, the anonymous litter of neglect. She cleared it methodically, starting from the shed door and working outward in a radius that expanded as her confidence in the project grew. The weeds came out by hand, her swollen fingers working around the root systems, pulling until the ground was bare. The broken stone, she sorted pieces too large to use for anything. She set aside in a pile smaller pieces she kept. When the ground was clear, she began to lay the flat stones. She had been looking at the quarry floor differently since the pipe project, the way you looked at a space once you understood it could be worked with. The quarry was full of flat limestone fragments that had broken off the walls over decades, pieces ranging from the size of a dinner plate to the size of a car hood. She selected them with a deliberateness that she recognized distantly as the same instinct she had used when she was designing spaces inside houses, the eye for proportion, for the relationship between pieces, for the way different textures created a surface that was more than the sum of its parts. She hauled them one at a time. Some pieces she could carry, others she had to drag, working them across the quarry floor on their edges, her back announcing its formal position on the matter with every movement. She set them in front of the shed in an arrangement that was not quite a path and not quite a patio, but something in between, something intentional. The gaps between the larger pieces she filled with smaller stones, pressing them into the soil with her palms until they sat level and solid. It took a week. By the end, she had created perhaps 200 square feet of stone surface extending from the shed door toward the spring. It was not perfectly flat. The stones were different sizes and different colors. The limestone ranged from pale cream to the darker gray of deeper rock, and the arrangement reflected the available materials rather than any formal design principle. But it was deliberate. You could see in it the choices someone had made. Loretta stood on the completed surface on a gray December morning and looked at it with the particular feeling of someone who has made something with their hands and is seeing it for the first time as a finished thing rather than as work in progress. Her back hurt. Her hands were worse than they had been in October. She was cold in the specific way that people who lived without adequate heating were cold, not the surface cold of being outside for a while, but the deeper cold of a body that had been working to maintain its own temperature for weeks and was running below optimal. She was also, in a way she couldn't fully account for, satisfied. It was then that she made the mistake with the pipes. She had been thinking about extending the water system, running a second line along the quarry wall to create a cascade effect, water spilling from one level to the next as the pipe stepped down the grade of the quarry floor. She had the pipe for it. She spent a morning arranging the sections along the wall, fitting them together, propping them at intervals on stones she had set as supports. What she hadn't calculated was the angle of the second to last section, where the grade changed more sharply than she'd measured. When she opened the flow from the first pipe into the new extension, the water moved as expected through the first two sections, then hit the angle change and came out wrong, not flowing down into the next section, but sheeting sideways off the fitting joint, running down the quarry wall in a broad silver curtain that caught the thin December light and fell into a natural depression in the quarry floor she hadn't noticed before. She stood watching it happen, calculating the loss, planning the fix. Then she stopped calculating. The water falling down the quarry wall made a sound she hadn't heard in the quarry before. Not the quiet movement of the spring, not the deliberate flow through the pipe. This was something fuller, the sound of water falling freely through air, landing in the stone depression below, creating a small pool that was already clear and still at its center, even while the edges moved. It echoed slightly off the limestone walls, multiplied by the acoustics of the enclosed space, becoming something larger than a single sound. The quarry, which had pressed its silence against her for weeks, was no longer silent. Loretta sat down on one of the flat stones she'd laid and listened to the water and understood with a certainty that came from somewhere below, reasoning that she was not going to fix the angle. She was going to find more pipe and create what had just happened accidentally on purpose, multiple times along the full length of the quarry wall. She had made music from rusted pipe and bad arithmetic, and she was keeping it. The storm came on a Tuesday. She felt it building through the Monday night, the pressure change that her joints registered before any instrument could measure it, a deep achiness in the knuckle beds and wrist tendons that was different from the ordinary arthritis pain and that she had learned over years to read as weather. By morning, the sky above the quarry rim was the color of old pewter uniform and without depth, and the wind had shifted direction. By midday, the rain began. By midnight, the rain had become something other than rain. The water found every weakness in the shed's aging structure, came through the failed patches in the roof in thin streams that hit the concrete floor and ran toward the low corner, seeped under the door along the gap she'd never fully sealed, worked through the cracked window despite the plastic sheet she'd taped over it. The floor became a shallow lake. She moved the mattress to the highest point of the floor, which was not high enough, and sat on it with her coat over her and listened to the rain finding new ways in. The temperature dropped through the night. The rain became mixed with something harder. Ice crystals rattling against the metal of the roof patch, and the cold that came through the walls was different from winter cold. It was the wet cold that went into the bone and stayed. She built the fire up as far as she dared in the small metal stove she'd constructed in the first weeks, a half-barrel cut down and fitted with a chimney of salvaged pipe, and huddled close to it and thought about her foot. She had slipped 2 hours ago going out to clear the water channeling pipe so it wouldn't back up and send water toward the shed. She had gone in the rain because it needed to be done, and she was the only one there to do it. The quarry floor was a mirror of black water, and she had gone down hard on her right side, her shoulder taking the first impact, and then her foot catching on a section of pipe and twisting under her full weight as she fell. She had gotten up and done what needed to be done and come back inside, and now her foot was swollen in the boot, and the color of what she could see above the boot top was wrong. Probably not broken, she had broken her wrist once years ago, and remembered the specific authoritative quality of that pain. This was different, but badly bruised, possibly fractured, and there was no money for a doctor and no one to drive her, and the storm was still coming down. She lay on the mattress and looked at the ceiling and let herself arrive at the thought she had been keeping at a distance for 2 days. She was 64 years old. She was alone in an abandoned quarry, in a storm with a bad foot, and $82, and a body that had been operating below sustainable conditions for 6 weeks. She was cold in a way that felt permanent. Her chest had developed a cough that rattled when she breathed and had not gone away in 4 days. She had protein bars enough for 3 more days, rice enough for a week if she was careful. She picked up her phone from where it sat on the workbench, charging from the small power bank she'd been rationing carefully. The screen lit up. No missed calls, no messages. She opened her photos, found the one from last Christmas, her and Clifton standing in front of the tree in the living room on Millbrook Drive, his arm around her shoulder. Both of them smiling the practiced smile of people who had been performing this particular tableau for decades. The tree was decorated with ornaments she had collected over 30 years, each one with its own small history. The room behind them was warm and specific with the accumulated choices of someone who had spent her adult life making spaces feel like home. The woman in that photograph looked safe. She looked like someone for whom December was a season of warmth and light and the familiar comfort of a life that made sense. She also, Loretta realized, looking at it now, with the rain coming through her ceiling and her foot throbbing and the cold pressing against every surface of the shed, she also looked like someone who was not quite there, present in the frame, not present in the way the word meant something real. She lowered the phone and let it go dark. The shed was lit now only by the fire in the half-barrel stove, the orange light moving on the concrete walls making the shadows shift. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and let the thought she had been holding at arm's length come fully into the room. What if she stopped? Not dramatically, just stopped trying, stopped hauling pipe and laying stone and figuring out how to make water move through salvaged fittings. She could call her daughter, get in the Civic and drive to Staunton, sleep on Darlene's couch again. Admit that Clifton had been right. Not that she was worthless, but that this particular idea that a 64-year-old woman with arthritis and no money and a bad back could do anything with an abandoned quarry was simply more than she was. It was a reasonable thought. There was nothing dramatic or self-destructive about it. It was just arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not in her favor. She lay with the thought for a long time. The fire popped. The rain continued its argument with the roof. Her foot pulsed in the boot. The cough came again, rattling through her chest like something loose. Then she turned her head and looked at the workbench. The tin box was there. She'd left it on the workbench when she'd first found it, not wanting to put it in a suitcase where it might get damp, wanting to keep it visible. It sat now in the firelight, the corroded metal catching the orange glow unevenly, the lid she'd pried open and replaced sitting slightly crooked. Inside it, seeds wrapped in oilcloth. Someone's belief in a spring that hadn't happened yet. She looked at the tin for a long time without moving. The quarry didn't know it had water running behind its walls. Didn't know it had limestone layers of cream and rose pink hidden under the first gray surface. It was just a hole in the ground that had been used for what someone needed and then left when it stopped being convenient. And underneath all of that, the water had kept moving. The stone had kept being what it actually was. The tin had kept its seeds dry for decades, patient as stone, certain of a spring it had no way to know would come. Loretta sat up. The movement cost her. Her back seized in the lower left, and her foot reminded her immediately and emphatically of its condition, and the cough came back. She sat on the edge of the mattress, and breathed through it, all of it, the pain and the calm and the sound of rain that was not stopping. Then she stood up, put weight on the bad foot, carefully found it bearable, redistributed, went to the stove and added the last of the split wood she'd brought inside before the storm, went to the shelf where she kept the food and took down the pot and measured rice and water and put it on the grate over the fire. Because if she believed in whatever battered and partial way she was capable of believing it right now, that she had value that didn't require Clifton Vance's confirmation or her children's agreement or anyone else's recognition to exist, then she owed herself a hot meal. Even now, especially now. The quarry's water didn't stop moving because no one was watching it. The seeds didn't dissolve because no one came back to plant them. She was still here. That meant something. She was going to act like it meant something. The storm continued through the next day and into the following night. Loretta rested her foot, kept the fire, ate, carefully slept in intervals. On the second afternoon, she went out in the rain because the water channel needed clearing. And she was the one who knew where everything was, and this time she went slowly and held the quarry wall with one hand the entire way. On the third night, pulling her coat tighter and listening to the storm work its way through every remaining weakness in the shed's structure, she went out one more time, not for the pipes. She went to the section of wall where the cascade she'd accidentally created ran during dry weather, and she stood in the rain with her bad foot and her rattling cough, and she looked at the rock face in the dark. Her hand found a section of the wall that felt different. Not loose stable, but the surface texture changed under her fingers. The stone here smoother, slightly concave where water erosion had worked at it for longer than anywhere else she'd touched. She pressed her palm flat against it, the way she'd pressed it against the spring wall on the first morning. And then, because she was a person who had spent 6 weeks learning that abandoned things gave up their secrets to patience and pressure, she pushed. The section gave. Not dramatically, no collapse, no sudden revelation. Just a section of outer limestone face, perhaps 2 inches thick, that had been separated from the wall behind it by years of water moving between them, rotating inward on the pressure of her hand, and then stopping against the solid rock behind. But the gap it revealed was real. A cavity perhaps 8 inches deep running vertically through the wall's face. And from that cavity, water flowed, not the thin seep of the spring, but a real movement of water, steady and clear, running down the exposed inner face of the gap and out across the quarry floor. And the face of the inner rock, the surface that had been sealed behind the outer limestone and touched by nothing but water for decades, was covered in mineral deposits that caught even the flat light of a stormy night and returned it as something brighter. Calcite, quartz. The small geometry of crystals formed slowly in sealed darkness, built by mineral-rich water over years beyond counting, having no knowledge of being beautiful and no need of it. Loretta reached into the gap and broke a piece free, a fragment the size of her palm, rough on the outside where it had been part of the wall, face crystalline on the broken interior surface, the crystals catching the thin rain light and throwing it back in small scattered points. She stood in the rain holding a piece of the quarry's interior and felt something she had not felt in 6 weeks. Not relief, not vindication. Something quieter and more fundamental than either. She had been told this place was worthless by a man who had not looked at it carefully, who had not pressed his hand against the walls, who had not stayed long enough for the morning light to show him what the stone actually was. He had been wrong about the quarry in exactly the way and for exactly the same reason he had been wrong about her. Loretta tilted her face up to the rain. The sound that came out of her was not composed. It was not the dignified response of a woman who had made peace with difficult circumstances. It was something older and less controlled than that laughter that had been stored at pressure for a long time and was coming out now, whether she intended it or not, mixed with the rain and the cold and the rattle in her chest, completely undignified, completely real. She laughed in the rain in her abandoned quarry, with a piece of crystalline rock in her arthritic hands and a bad foot and a cough and $82 to her name. Then she carried the rock inside and set it on the workbench next to the tin box where the firelight found it immediately and did what firelight did with crystal, which was to make it seem like it contained its own small source of illumination. She looked at it for a long time before she slept. The storm ended on a Thursday morning. Loretta woke to silence, the specific silence that followed, sustained noise, the kind that had its own texture and weight. She lay still for a moment, registering it. Then she got up, tested the foot still swollen, but moving, and went to the door. The quarry was transformed in the way that outdoor spaces were transformed by rain, every surface darker and more itself, the limestone walls running with the last of the water, the quarry floor reflecting the pale morning sky in a dozen small pools. The cascade she'd made along the wall was running full, the water bright and moving, the sound of it filling the quarry from wall to wall. She stood in the cold, clean air and breathed. Her foot hurt. Her chest rattled. The shed behind her needed more work than she could complete in a season. She had rice enough for 5 days and the specific exhaustion of a person who had spent 3 days managing a crisis on a body that was already depleted. She also had a piece of crystalline rock on her workbench that the quarry had been holding in its walls since before anyone had decided what the quarry was worth. She went inside and made coffee on the camp stove, real coffee from the last of a bag she'd been rationing, because the storm was over and she was still here. And that seemed like a reason to stop rationing, and sat on the flat stone outside the shed door with the mug warming her hands and looked at what she'd built. The stone surface she'd laid, the pipe system along the wall, the cascade running clean in the storm's aftermath, the cleared quarry floor. The shed behind her with its patched roof and its painted walls and the small stove that had kept her alive through a 3-day storm. She had done this. With arthritic hands and a bad back and no money and no plan beyond the next day's work. She had done this because someone had to, and she was the only one there, and because at some point in the past 6 weeks she had stopped waiting to be told she was worth the effort. The marigold seeds were still in the tin on the workbench. Spring was still months away. She finished the coffee and went back to work. April came to the quarry the way it came to the rest of the Shenandoah Valley, not all at once, but in increments each day, slightly longer and slightly less cold than the one before, the change so gradual that you only noticed it by comparison, by looking back at where you had been and measuring the distance. Loretta noticed it in the marigolds first. She had planted the seeds in late March on a morning when the soil had finally thawed deep enough to work pressing each one into the ground with her thumb at the interval printed on the paper envelope she'd found in the tin. The ground along the south-facing quarry wall received the most direct sun, and she had prepared it carefully over several days, breaking up the compacted soil with a metal rod, working in the composted plant matter she'd accumulated through the winter, raking it level with a patience that her back complained about and she ignored. She planted in a long row at the base of the wall where the water from the cascade kept the soil consistently damp without flooding it. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. She checked every morning, pressed her fingers gently into the soil near where she'd planted, not disturbing the seeds, just making contact. The earth was cold still in the mornings, warming through the day, cooling again at night. She watered carefully. She waited. Then on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March, she crouched at the base of the wall and saw the first of them pushing through. A small fold of green, pale and precise, the size of her thumbnail. Then another 6 inches down the row. Then 3 more, each one emerging with the specific determination of something that had been doing its work underground all along and had simply reached the point where above ground was the next necessary thing. Loretta crouched in the dirt with her arthritic hands on her knees and looked at those seedlings for a long time. She was 64 years old and she had planted seeds and they had grown, and this should not have felt as significant as it did. But it felt significant in the way that only simple things could, not complicated or dramatic, just deeply, quietly true. Someone had kept those seeds in oilcloth in a tin box under the floor of a shed for years beyond counting, believing they were worth keeping. And they had been right. She did not cry. She had cried what needed to be cried in the storm in December on the mouse-stained mattress into the cold dark of a shed that was not yet the thing it was becoming. What she felt now was different, smaller in volume and larger in weight, the feeling of something being confirmed. She got up, which took a moment, in the cooperation of a back that was warmer now and more willing, and went back to work. By the time April fully arrived, the quarry was a different place than the one she had driven into the previous November. The cascades along the south wall ran continuously, the water moving down the stepped limestone face, in the particular way she had learned to engineer, not trying to control where it went, but working with the grade and the existing features of the rock to give it a useful direction. The sound of it had become the quarry's ambient voice, a constant, gentle presence that replaced the silence that had pressed against her in the first weeks like something solid. The stone surface she'd laid in front of the shed had expanded. She'd spent February extending it along the quarry floor toward the pool at the base of the original spring, creating a path that connected the shed to the water in a way that could be walked without picking through rubble. She'd edged it with pieces of metal salvaged from the machinery graveyard, hammered flat, and pressed into the soil to create a border. It wasn't a path you'd find in a garden catalog. It was a path made by someone who understood what she had to work with and had decided that was enough. The marigolds were 3 inches high now and had the dark green particular to plants that were growing strongly, plants that had decided the conditions were adequate and had committed. The shed itself had changed the most. She'd found paint old cans at the back of the shed's storage that had thickened but not fully dried, a gray and a pale yellow and a white, and had used them on the interior walls in a wash thin enough to apply with a rag, working section by section over 2 weeks, covering the mildew stains and the marks of years of damp with something clean and deliberate. The mosaic floor had taken another 2 weeks, setting small pieces of broken limestone into the concrete surface in a pattern that followed the natural variations in the stone's color, the cream and the tan and the occasional rose pink of deeper rock. It was not fine work. It was the work of someone learning a skill by doing it, and it looked like that, and she had decided that was also enough. The workbench held the tin box and the crystalline rock from the storm night wall, and between them she'd placed other things she'd found in the quarry over the months: a piece of iron with an interesting erosion pattern, a section of limestone with a vein of darker mineral running through it at a precise angle, a handful of quartz pebbles from the base of the cascade pool that the water had worn smooth. Small, arbitrary things that she found beautiful, and that no one would have called valuable, and that she kept because she had learned that her definition of valuable was the one that mattered in this particular space. She was inside the shed on a Tuesday morning in April when she heard the car. The sound of an engine was so foreign to the quarry's acoustic world, weeks could pass without a vehicle coming down the gravel road that led from the highway, that she heard it before she identified it, the way you heard something that didn't belong in the soundscape of a place before your brain supplied a category for it. Then the gravel crunch of tires slowing, then stopping. She set down the tool she was holding and went to the door. The car was a silver Mercedes E-Class. She recognized it the way she recognized a piece of furniture that had been in her house for years, not by consciously noting its features, but by the total impression of it immediately and without effort. She had been in that car hundreds of times. She knew the sound of its particular engine, the way the driver's door had a slightly different quality to its closure than the passenger side. Clifton got out. He looked the same and different in the way that people looked when you saw them after months during which you yourself had changed considerably. He was wearing the kind of casual clothes he wore on weekends, good quality, carefully maintained, and he had the expression of a man who had rehearsed an approach and was now deploying it. He stood beside his car and looked around the quarry, and the rehearsed expression was replaced by something he hadn't prepared for. She watched his face change from the shed doorway. The performance of composure that he'd arrived with, she recognized it. She had watched him compose himself for difficult conversations for 30 years, gave way to something unguarded. He turned slowly, taking in the cascades along the wall, the cleared quarry floor, the stone path, the marigolds in their long row of new green, the shed behind her with its painted walls visible through the open door. He looked the way people looked when they found something where they expected to find nothing. Loretta stepped out of the doorway and walked toward him, crossing the stone path she had laid stone by stone over a November and December and January. She walked at the pace her body had settled into over months of working in this space, not hurried, not performing steadiness, just moving at the speed that this ground and these joints and this life had arrived at together. She stopped 10 feet from him, let him look. He had come, she understood, because he had tried to sell the quarry and discovered she was living in it and that it was no longer the thing he had given her. She had learned this from the single voicemail she'd listened to 3 weeks ago, a real estate agent named Perkins from Staunton, calling on behalf of the owner of record, asking if she was the current occupant of the Carver Road quarry property. She had not called Perkins back. She had gone out and extended the cascade by another 12 feet. "My God," Clifton said. His voice had the quality it got when he was genuinely surprised, which was rare enough that she had always paid attention to it. "What have you done?" It wasn't a question. It was what a person said when the question they meant was too large to ask directly. Loretta looked at him. She waited for the feeling she had been anticipating for months, The complex cocktail of vindication and anger and grief and the need to be seen that she had imagined she would feel when this moment arrived, because she had known it would arrive, had known Clifton well enough to know that he was not a man who left things unresolved when resolution might benefit him. She felt none of it. What she felt was the ground under her feet solid and specific, the cold April air moving down from the quarry rim, the distant sound of the water along the wall. She felt present in this space in a way that had nothing to do with Clifton Vance standing 10 feet away from her. The quarry was not more real because he was here to see it. She was not more real because he was here to see her. That was new. She recognized the thing that had actually changed. "Hello, Clifton," she said. He walked toward her, slowly looking around as he moved, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had expected to find. She watched him look at the cascade, at the marigolds, at the stone path, at the shed behind her with its functional chimney and its painted walls. "Did you do all of this?" he said. "All of it yourself. Who else?" He shook his head, and she recognized the gesture. He used it when he encountered something he couldn't immediately categorize. He walked past her to the cascade wall and stood looking at the water moving down the stepped limestone face, and she could see him trying to understand the engineering of it, the way she had tried to understand it herself before she'd simply started doing it and let the water show her what it needed. "Loretta," he said. He turned to face her. He stopped. "Started again. I had no idea you were capable of something like this." There it was. 30 years of marriage reduced to a single sentence that contained everything that had been wrong with it. Not cruelty, not malice. Simple, genuine blindness. He was not being condescending. He was being honest. He had genuinely not known. He had lived with her for 30 years, eaten the meals she made, and inhabited the spaces she created, and benefited daily from the practical intelligence she applied to every surface of their shared life, and he had genuinely not known. "Neither did I," she said. "I didn't know because I never had the chance to find out. You gave me this quarry because you thought there was nothing here, because you thought I didn't have anything in me that could do anything with nothing." He was quiet. She let him be quiet. "I made a mistake," he said finally. His voice had a quality she had not heard in a long time. It was the voice he used when he was saying something that cost him something. "Loretta, I'd like to fix this, if you'd consider coming back." She looked at him. The man in front of her was not a monster. She had never needed him to be a monster. He was a man of a particular generation and a particular set of assumptions who had looked at his wife for 30 years and seen the output of her labor without ever becoming curious about its source. Who had made decisions about what she was capable of and what she needed and what was fair based on those uncurious assumptions. Who had replaced her with someone younger when the arrangement became inconvenient and believed he was being reasonable. He was not a monster. He was something more common and in some ways more difficult to address a person who had simply never looked closely enough. "No," she said. He waited as if the word might be followed by a qualification, a hedge, the kind of softening she had spent 30 years applying to difficult things she had to say to him. She didn't add anything. "Clifton," she said, "look at this place." She gestured not dramatically, just a movement of her hand that included the walls and the water and the marigolds and the path and the shed. "Do you know why it looks like this?" He glanced around. "Because you worked very hard on it, because I made it for myself." She said it without emphasis, as a simple fact. "Not for you, not to prove something to you or anyone else, not to show you or our children or anyone what I was capable of. I made it because I needed to know what I was capable of, because I had spent 30 years making things beautiful for other people, and I had never once made something beautiful for myself, and I didn't know what that felt like." She looked at him steadily. "Now I know, and I'm not trading what I know for what I had before." He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with the expression of a man who had come expecting a negotiation and found that the other party had already reached their conclusion before the meeting began. She recognized the expression. She had been on the other side of it once. He left 20 minutes later after a conversation that was shorter than it might have been because she had discovered she didn't need length. She watched the silver Mercedes move up the gravel road and disappear past the quarry rim, and she felt the relief of someone who has completed a thing they had been carrying. Then she went back to work. Bertie Oaks arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in June. She was 70 years old with white hair, cut short and sensibly, and a face that carried its years without apology, and she drove a pickup truck that had more miles on it than its body suggested was advisable. She parked at the quarry entrance and walked down the path Loretta had laid, looking at everything she passed with the careful attention of someone taking an inventory. Loretta was at the cascade wall adjusting a section of pipe that had shifted in the spring thaw when she heard the footsteps on the stone. She looked up. The woman stopped at a respectful distance and said, "I heard there was someone living out here, doing something with the old quarry." She looked at the cascade running down the wall behind Loretta. "I had to see for myself." Loretta set down her tool. "You've seen it, I have," the woman said. She was quiet for a moment, still looking at the water. "My name is Bertie Oakes. I live about 4 miles east on Route 11. My daughter found out about this place from someone in town." Loretta introduced herself and waited. Bertie looked at the marigolds, which were in full bloom, now orange and yellow, emphatic and unambiguous, in the July heat, running the full length of the south wall, in a line that made the gray limestone behind them look like a deliberate backdrop. She looked at the mosaic path and the cascade pools and the shed with its chimney and its painted walls. "My children," Bertie said, "are trying to get me into an assisted living facility in Harrisonburg." She said it the way people said things they had been living with long enough that the words had lost some of their sharpness and become simply true. "They say I can't manage on my own anymore. They say I'm too old to take care of myself." "How old are you?" Loretta asked. 70. "And can you take care of yourself?" Bertie looked at her. "I've been doing it for 40 years without assistance. I don't see why 70 is the number that changes things." Loretta nodded. "Come and see the rest of it," she said. They walked the quarry together that afternoon, Loretta showing what she'd built, with the economy of someone who had learned that the work spoke better than the explanation. She showed Bertie how the pipe system worked, the way the water moved down from the spring, through the cascade to the pools, the logic of it that she'd arrived at through trial and error rather than knowledge. She showed the marigold row and the cave pocket she'd found in the quarry wall in February, expanded cautiously to reveal the mineral deposits inside the calcite formations that caught any light that reached them and returned it multiplied. Bertie put her hand against the cave wall and looked at the crystals in the beam of Loretta's flashlight for a long time without speaking. "I used to do leather work," she said finally. "Before Arthur died, I had a studio set up in the back of the garage. When he passed, my daughter said I should clear it out, make the space useful." She said it with the precision of someone choosing each word. "Did you clear it out?" Loretta asked. "I haven't touched it in 3 years. They were quiet for a moment there in the small cave in the quarry wall, with the sound of the cascade outside. "The work I did in this quarry," Loretta said. She paused, choosing. "It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It started that way, I won't pretend it didn't. But somewhere in the middle of it, it became something else. It became about finding out what these hands could do when nobody was telling them what they were supposed to be doing." Bertie looked at her. "And what could they do?" "More than I knew. And they're arthritic and 64 years old, and they still did more than I knew." Bertie came back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. She brought work gloves the second time, and Loretta put her to work on the section of quarry wall she'd been meaning to clear for months, debris built up against the limestone old vegetation, broken rock that needed moving before the wall's natural color could be properly revealed. Bertie worked with the focused competence of a person who had been doing physical work their entire life and had simply been told recently that they shouldn't. In August, she brought a woman named Patricia Dunwoody, 58, recently divorced, who drove from Waynesboro and stood at the quarry entrance looking down at what had been built and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "Can I help with something?" And Loretta said yes and handed her a trowel and showed her where to extend the mosaic. In September came two more. Eleanor, 66, whose husband had left her for someone in his office, and who had spent a year being told by everyone who loved her that the important thing was to keep a positive attitude. And June, 72, who had raised 4 children and built a small business from nothing and been written off as useless by all 4 children simultaneously when she'd sold the business because her knees no longer allowed her to manage the floor. They came without invitation, without announcement, without any organizing principle, except that someone had told someone else about a woman in an abandoned quarry who had built something from nothing at 64, and that story had moved through the particular network of women who were looking for evidence that such things were possible. Loretta did not run workshops. She did not have a method or a philosophy she put into words. She had a quarry that needed continued work and more hands than she had, and she put people to work in it and showed them by doing, rather than explaining, which was the way she had always learned best, in the way she had come to understand most people learn best when they stopped being told they were past the age of learning. On a Wednesday afternoon in early October, Bertie came with her daughter. Deanna Oakes was 42 years old with her mother's direct way of looking at things and a quality of held-in exhaustion that Loretta recognized from her own face in the December phone screen. She was going through a divorce. She had two children who lived primarily with their father during the week. She had a job she was good at in a life that had the shape of someone else's idea of what her life should be, and she had been told by several people who loved her that 42 was young and she had so much ahead of her and she just needed some time. She stood at the quarry entrance and looked down at what was happening below. Five women working in the afternoon light, the cascade running the marigolds in their last weeks of bloom, the mosaic path extending, and the cave pocket lit by a small battery lamp Bertie had brought, and she said nothing. Loretta climbed up to meet her at the entrance. They walked down together, and Loretta let the quarry do what the quarry did, which was to present itself without explanation. She watched Deanna look at things, at the pipework along the walls, at the mosaic, at the women working without hurry, at their own pace, talking or not talking as they chose, at the marigolds. Your mom told me, Deanna said, about how this started. She paused. About November. Most of it, Loretta said. She said you almost didn't keep going. Loretta looked out at the quarry. The afternoon light was doing what it did at this time of year, coming over the western rim at a low angle that hit the limestone at full force and turned the walls the color of warm honey. The cascade caught the light and scattered it. Somewhere in the cave pocket, the crystals were doing what crystals did in any light, which was to take what was given and return it as something more. There was a night in December, Loretta said. A storm. She was quiet for a moment, not for effect, but because the memory still had weight, and she had learned to respect the weight of things rather than rushing past them. I had a bad foot, and I was running out of food, and the shed was flooding, and nobody had called. She paused. I lay on the mattress and I thought about stopping. Really thought about it. Not in a dramatic way, just the arithmetic didn't look good, and I thought maybe the arithmetic was the point. Deanna was listening the way people listen when they were not constructing their response, but actually receiving what was being said. What changed, she asked. There was a tin box on my workbench, Loretta said. Someone had buried it under the concrete floor years before I arrived. Seeds wrapped in oilcloth. Marigold seeds. She nodded toward the south wall where the orange and yellow were still vivid in the late afternoon light, less numerous now, as October moved toward frost, but still present, still doing the work they had always done. I looked at that box and I thought somebody kept those seeds dry through every winter. This quarry sat empty. Somebody believed this place was worth planting in. And the seeds didn't know anyone was coming. They just stayed ready. She looked at Deanna directly. The quarry didn't know it had water running behind its walls. It didn't know it had crystals forming in the dark inside the stone. It was just existing, being what it was, and I came along and looked closer and found those things. They were there the whole time. The value was there whether anyone confirmed it or not. Deanna looked at the wall for a long moment. I feel like I can't see anything clearly right now, she said. Like everything that used to tell me who I was has been removed, and I don't know what's left, good, Loretta said. Deanna looked at her. That's the only place you can start from, Loretta said. Not good meaning easy, I know it's not easy, but good meaning real. You're standing in the cleared space. The question is what you decide to build in it, and you're 42. She let that rest for a moment. I started at 64 with arthritic hands and $82 in a shed with a hole in the roof. You have decades. They stood together at the edge of the quarry and looked down at the women working in the afternoon light and the water moving along the walls and the marigolds holding their color against the approach of autumn. I don't know if I'm strong enough, Deanna said. You don't find out if you're strong enough by knowing in advance, Loretta said. You find out by doing the next thing and then the next thing. One day at a time, the one small act of making something at a time. The strength isn't something you have, it's something you build. Same way I built the path. One stone, then the next one, then the next one. A month later, on a morning in the first week of November, Loretta walked to the quarry entrance and turned and looked down at what the year had made. She was 65 years old. Her birthday had been in May, celebrated with a tomato from the first plant she'd put in the ground and a cup of coffee and the particular satisfaction of someone who has arrived at an age they weren't certain they were heading toward and found it acceptable. Her hair was fully gray now and long enough that she braided it most days, and she had stopped thinking about it much beyond that. Her hands were more swollen than they had been in November of the previous year. The arthritis progressed as it would progress regardless, and she had adapted to working with them the way they were rather than the way they had been. Her body was lean in a way it hadn't been in decades, the fat burned off by a year of hard work in eating enough rather than abundantly. It hurt in ways that were specific and informative rather than the ambient, mysterious hurt of someone sitting still in a life that didn't fit. She looked 65. She felt like someone who was becoming more fully themselves at 65 than she had been at 40 or 50 or 60, and she had stopped being surprised by this. The quarry below her was terraced now. The stone path extended into a network of walking surfaces that connected the shed to the cascade wall to the cave pocket, to the garden plots where the last of the season's growth was coming to its natural conclusion. 7 women had been there on Wednesday of the previous week, working on different things, the sound of their conversation and occasional laughter, moving through the quarry's acoustic space in a way that the limestone walls received and distributed evenly, the way the walls distributed everything without preference, without judgment, giving back what was given. Clifton had sold the house on Millbrook Drive in August. She had heard this from her youngest, who had called unexpectedly, the first call in 7 months to let her know. The tone of the call had been different from the last ones before the quarry, before November. Her daughter had asked how she was, had listened to the answer, had said after a pause that had a quality of genuine consideration in it that she would like to come and see the place sometime. Loretta had said that would be fine. Clifton had moved to Richmond. She wished him if she thought about it, which was rarely and with less feeling than she would have predicted a life proportionate to his understanding of it. She turned and walked back down into the quarry, the path solid under her feet, the water moving along the walls in its continuous, indifferent way, the cascade catching the thin November light and doing what water always did with light, which was to multiply it and scatter it and return it to the world as something more present than it had been before. The cave pocket was lit this morning. The small battery lamp Bertie had installed running on its timer, the mineral formations inside doing their work with the light they were given. The marigolds had finished for the season, the stems dried to the color of old straw, the seeds she'd collected and stored already in oilcloth in the tin box on the workbench, ready for a spring that was months away and entirely worth saving them for. She went to the workbench, picked up the tin, held it with both swollen hands feeling its familiar weight, the corroded metal slightly rough against her palms. On the inside of the tin's lid, she had painted in the spring, in the thin gray paint she'd used on the shed walls, 4 lines in the careful handwriting of someone who had not written on surfaces before but had decided this particular surface warranted it. She read them now not because she'd forgotten them, but because some things were worth reading in the morning, in the same way the water was worth looking at, and the light on the walls was worth watching, and the marigolds had been worth tending through a season that ended and would come again. You were always the quarry. Water was flowing behind your walls the whole time. You just needed someone to look close enough. You just needed that someone to be you. She set the tin down, picked up the crystalline rock from its place beside it, the piece she had broken from the wall in the storm, the piece she had carried back through December rain with a rattling cough and a bad foot, and something cracked open in her chest that was not quite laughing and not quite crying, and had become over the months the sound of a person who had decided to keep going. The crystals caught the morning light from the shed window and scattered it across the painted walls in small moving points the way they always did, the way they would continue to do long after she was finished marveling at it. She set it back down and went outside. The quarry waited in the November morning, patient and specific and entirely itself, the water moving and the light working and the season doing what seasons did, which was to change without asking permission and without regret. Loretta stood on the stone path she had made stone by stone from what was already there and breathed the cold air and felt the ground under her feet and thought about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing after that, all the way out to a spring she had not arrived at yet, but was entirely certain was coming, because water moved and seeds waited, and stone held its beauty in the dark until someone came along and looked closely enough to find it. She went back to work.